Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming to today's Augusta Baker Diversity Lecture. My name is Sierra, and I'm a doctoral student at the University of South Carolina in Columbia in the Library and Information Science program. I'm also the research assistant and advisee to the illustrious Dr. Nicole Cook, the University of South Carolina's Augusta Baker Endowed Chair. We are so excited that you're here with us today, and I have the immense pleasure of introducing our wonderful speaker, Dr. Thomas Chris. But before we get started, I want to quickly go over some Zoom housekeeping. Today's session will be recorded, and the recording, along with additional resources from Dr. Chris, will be sent out to every registered guest, so you'll get all the good stuff. We just ask that you mute yourself during his presentation, but utilize the chat feature to ask questions and share any reactions you have to all of this great information you're about to get. But there will be a portion where we will encourage you to unmute yourself and ask questions directly to Dr. Chris. So let's get into it. Dr. Chris is the Associate Professor of Children's Literature and Literacy in the Department of Early Childhood and Elementary Education at Georgia State University. His scholarly work focuses on issues of representation in children's and young adult literature, media, and culture. He is concerned primarily with literature by and about people who self-identify as LGBTQ+. Chris is an international youth literacy fellow who regularly publishes in academic journals and books. With Suzanne M. Nazak and Roberta Price Gardner, he is the co-editor of Reading and Teaching with Diverse Nonfiction Children's Books, Representations and Possibilities. He is currently the past president of the Children's Literature Association and is concluding a 3-year term as the co-editor of the Journal of Children's Literature, of the Children's Literature Assembly, and the National Council of Teachers of English. Y'all, we are in for a treat, so let's all welcome Dr. Thomas Chris.
Thank you so much for that great introduction, and thank you everybody for being here today. I am going to go ahead and share my screen, and I'm going to do just a portion of it so that I can jump here. And hopefully this will work where you can see my slides and then I can see my notes. The title of my talk today is simply Notes on Allies and Accomplices in LGBTQ+ Children's Literature Studies. So if that's not something that you are interested in or not what you thought you were signing up for, my feelings won't be hurt. I won't even see if you disappear or anything like that. So I tried to structure my slides as a book because I love books very, very much. So hopefully we'll see some pages turn. So far, so good. And then I thought it might make sense to open with a quotation. And this is something that I do in the courses I teach as well. I try not to talk about the quotations, even though that's difficult for me to do, and instead just kind of let them serve as a way of starting to create context for the work that we'll be doing together. So I kind of cheated here and I picked 2 quotations instead of just one. The first is from Joel Leon, and it speaks to just kind of allies and this idea of allyship generally. And the quotation is simply, if we all are to be free, then we all need to be allies in support of the liberation of us all. And then the second quotation is a little more specific to what I'll be speaking with you today. And it's older, it's 2004. And I think, unfortunately, it's still relevant and timely today. It's one you might know. It came out of School Library Journal from David Levithan. And it's simply this. Here's the thing. Being gay is not an issue. It's an identity. It's not something you can agree or disagree with. It's a fact, and it must be defended and represented as a fact. And again, I won't talk about those now, but hopefully it will situate us in the work that we'll do together today. To give you a broad overview of where we'll be going, I'm going to start with my personal story, through which I'll share a bit about my social locations and my positionality, grounded in what Ken Crenshaw coined intersectionality. As I shift to look specifically at the idea of allyship and being an accomplice, I'll spend some time drawing on professional literature to define that terminology and then situate us around some shared definitions, understandings. And then as part of that, I'll be speaking kind of briefly about what this might mean and look like in children's literature studies more generally, before I then focus in for the final portion of it on thinking about what this means and looks like for those of us engaged in youth library services. What's it mean or look like to be an ally or an accomplice of LGBTQ plus people? And then at the end, we'll open things up for questions and conversation, and not just because the question part is always really scary to me because it's unknown, but really out of a more genuine place and not as self-serving. I'm happy to talk in there, but my dream is that all of you are going to start talking with one another because there's so much expertise in this space, and I feel a little uncomfortable in the position of expert at any time. So I'm hoping that you'll all view it as a discussion, and I'll actually have a few prompts that I'll put up at the end that we can use to guide that if you're interested. And while the actual discussion I know needs to take place at the end, I do want to invite all of you to share a thumbs up if you hear something that makes sense or you really like it or you agree with it, or a thumbs down if I say something that doesn't line up with your experience or expertise. Also, please utilize that chat feature. I am not offended by side conversations in any sort of way. I'm hopefully here to offer something useful, but I really want you to take that up and get out of the session what it is that you would like to get out of it. And then sticking with the opening of the book theme, I've got some acknowledgements that I want to start out with. I want to thank Dr. Nicole Cook for the invitation to deliver this lecture today. I want to thank Sierra and Kiera for their support, their encouragement, their patience with me throughout this entire process. When I was first invited to contribute to the Augusta Baker Diversity Lecture Series, my initial response was, no way. But those of you who know me know that that's kind of my response to almost anything at first. But I felt inadequate to the task. I was worried and wanted to say no, but I was also obviously very humbled by the invitation and having an opportunity to share some thoughts this way and share some of my work in a lecture series that bears the name of Augusta Baker is not something I take lightly. And Dr. Cook was kind enough to give me some time to consider the invitation. And as you can see, I eventually said yes, but it wasn't without great trepidation. And this is something I'll touch on more in this talk as well. So because it felt so important to me in preparing for this lecture, I viewed almost all of the lectures in this series. There are today, I think 27 in total. I didn't get through all of them. I tried really hard, but I was listening to them at like 1.5 times speed toward the end, which was not an effective way of engaging with the text. So I decided I have to just say, like, I almost got through all of them. And if you haven't had an opportunity to kind of go back to the beginning, 2020, and watch the inaugural address from Ebony Elizabeth Thomas, and then all the lectures in the series, it's such a fantastic text. I think it leads with race, as it should, and then also represents such a broad array of fields and disciplines and perspectives of individuals speaking that I'm going to try and draw whenever I can on things that were shared in previous lectures as well, because I think it shows as a great model for ways in which people are acting as allies and accomplices in children's literature and library services on a day-to-day basis. So one thing that I saw in lots of the different presentations was speakers like Beth Patton sharing their own stories and counter stories. I think there are lots of reasons that personal narrative can play such a prominent role in diversity work, including lectures such as these. When we think about DEI work, you'll often hear language along the lines of opening hearts and changing minds. Others will talk about a heart and heads approach. And I think that's one thing that personal narrative can do. Specifically within LGBTQ studies, Lisa Stulberg in LGBTQ social movements talks about the levels at which DEI work can happen and argues we need people working at the policy and legal level, but we also need people kind of doing hearts and minds work. These varied perspectives are prevalent throughout the Baker lectures, with folks like J.J. Pianki emphasizing hearts and minds work, while others like Katie Dover-Taylor and Barbara Jones focused more on professional or policy level changes. Counter storytelling is also a key tenet of critical race theory, and within critical paradigms more generally, narratives from those who fit within the dominant culture are everywhere. And Richard Delgado states that counter storytelling shines a light on stories, experiences, narratives, truths of communities that have been traditionally minoritized. And so through my brief personal narrative here, I hope to show and share some insights about who I am and make clear my own positionality in this work. And throughout this talk, as much as possible, I'll do my best to rely on research and scholarship to ground my perspective, but I do want to make clear that I'm speaking just from my perspective. I don't speak on behalf of all LGBTQ plus people because we're not a monolith. And I'll simply include a disclaimer here that all of us are works in progress with regard to helping each other as allies and accomplices and have varied life experiences, and that none of us has all the answers, and that language and words are fluid and to some extent open to interpretation. So as I began preparing this slideshow and pulling these things together, I found myself taking a trip down memory lane. So this image you've been looking at on the screen for some time now is a house that I lived in my very early childhood in South Haven, Michigan, was where I first lived. And when I lived there, I had two best friends who I've given various pseudonyms over the years. Lately, I've been calling them Rebecca and Brett. So Rebecca and Brett were my two best friends when I was about 4 years old, 4 to 5. And the three of us would walk together to school each day. And I met up with them on one particular morning when we were in kindergarten. So I was 5 at that point. And they told me that they had decided that they were now dating and they were a couple. And I remember walking the rest of the way to school from my house to the school a couple blocks away, feeling really left out. I watched the two of them walking side by side, a few steps in front of me, and can still remember to this day feeling jealous. And I remember the moment where it hit me. And I actually on Google Maps, like I traced the path we used to walk and I could find the spot where I had this realization. So it was a very surreal thing to be looking at an image of a space where I realized for the first time, as much as I can remember, that I was different, that I didn't fit in a way that I was supposed to fit. Because what I realized in that moment was my jealousy came not from the fact that Brett was the one who was going to date Rebecca, but that it was Rebecca and not I that got to date Brett. I remember both like the wave of fear and understanding about what it meant. And then by the time I was 5 here, I understood that it wasn't okay to be who I was. That feeling of fear and discomfort as a young child was a recognition that I didn't belong. Whatever I was feeling did not match up with what I knew I was supposed to be. I learned early on that the real world could be unpredictable and unkind, and that people can't always be trusted. There were very few spaces in the world that made sense to me, and one of the most profound places of refuge in my life was found in books. No matter what else was happening in life, I knew that each evening just before bed, my mom would read a story or a couple chapters of a book to me and my older brother and my little sister. So in that house, that you can see. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse cursor, but I'm kind of hovering it over to what looks like the right-hand side of the house. It's actually the back of the house, but that's where my mom used to read to us as we'd sit back there and she would read. When my mom read the book, The Boxcar Children, I fantasized about disappearing in the woods, discovering an old train car, and living on my own without anybody else there. And for several years, I would reenact that story again and again while I played alone in the backyard. And it was often difficult to distinguish where reality ended and fantasy began. And as I grew older, I would read and reread The Boxcar Children and its sequels. And I can remember to this day the paperback books lined up on my bookshelf and being grumpy if the numbers across the top didn't line up all the way as I thought they should. But those were books that I held on to for quite some time in my life. I remember pretending to be asleep and hiding the book under my pillow when my dad would come to check on me. And I remember wanting to be left alone when my parents wanted me to go out and play with the neighborhood kids. I was more interested in just reading my books. When I was in second grade, we moved from South Haven, Michigan to a little town called Holland, Michigan. And by the time I hit third grade, The Boxcar Children was replaced by another book, which was The Secret Garden. This picture of the house actually has a piece of driftwood out front that my grandfather put there when I was young so that I could use it as kind of the entry point to my secret garden. So I was kind of stunned to see that it was still there in that photo. Eventually, The Secret Garden would be replaced with another book, and then my family would move. again to another place where the last real landmark book I remember having as a teenager was the Ancient One. I need to say that while my childhood was shaped by people like T.A. Barron, Roald Dahl, C.S. Lewis, I need to make the obvious point that every single book I've referenced as a landmark book in my life is pretty problematic in terms of things like gender, race, nationality, disability, and other social locations. As a white, middle-class Christian boy growing up in the suburbs of Michigan in the United States, I had lots of opportunities to find books that appealed to me and represented people like me. In spite of this, and in spite of all of the books that I read over the years of my childhood and adolescence, it wasn't until I was in graduate school at Michigan State University, and that's where I lived. That was Spartan Village Apartments. I was here in H. But that was the first time I found a book studying children's literature as a doctoral student that represented what felt like the whole me. And that book was David Levithan's Boy Meets Boy. I remember buying the book at Barnes and Noble and hiding it underneath a couple other books so I could check out with it and it would get scanned and put in the bag. I went home. I remember everything about reading that book straight through and then just crying at the end of it, because the first time in my life I knew I was seeing that part of myself represented in books. And as voraciously as I read as a child, and as many times as I saw myself represented in different ways in text, it was a realization that there was such an important part of who I am that was missing. And I hadn't realized it until that moment, how profound that would be. So today I am a 41-year-old white man. I'll be 42 in 6 days, so I am solidly middle age. I'm a tenured associate professor at a university. I'm currently, and have been at various points in my life, a person of size. I'm a survivor of sexual assault. I'm physically non-disabled and have been assigned an array of labels from the many psychologists with whom I've worked ever since I was a teenager. So shout out to social anxiety, bipolar 2 people, a generalized anxiety, panic attacks, obsessive thoughts. I'm here with you. At times, I think I maybe should have listened to my parents and read a little less and socialized a bit more. They may have been right on that one, but books were always my first choice in friends. Granted, they would have been better friends to me as a kid if they had characters in them like the ones I found once I was an adult, but books have been dependable in ways and at times when real people are not. I know that I can trust children's books and that they're there whenever I need them. As such, it won't surprise you that libraries and bookstores were and are a refuge for me. And today, the copy of The Boxcar Children that my mother read to me as a child is one of my most cherished possessions, as is the secret garden key that my great-grandmother gave to me for those times I was playing make-believe in our yard. In graduate school, though, I didn't want to be the gay doc student who was working on gay lit topics. I was really resistant to it. But I was also really angry at what I was seeing around me, about the books that were being published, about books that were making their way or not making their way into classrooms, and about the lack of scholarship in this area. It's reminding me now in this moment that I forgot to do the second piece of my acknowledgements of folks like Debbie Reese, who was the first to say to me that it was okay for me to feel angry with the representations I was seeing. Thought partners like Chris Rhodes, Josh Coleman, John Wargo, Rob Bittner, Adam Crawley's got great work on trans identities. These are people who, if you don't know their names, please read the work that they're doing because it's really profound. But back to this. As a young professor, I did write a couple articles in a book chapter on inclusive practices and LGBTQ plus people in educational spaces. And so as I prepared this talk, one thing that kind of disappointed me was some of what I was finding today and felt like needed to be shared today isn't that different from what was being shared in 2008 and 2009. I started wondering what the young Thomas would think if I were to go back to him and say like, hey, you're going to be doing some of the same stuff, or describing the current cultural and political context in which we're living. I don't know what my reaction would have been. I do think I would have been stunned by the tremendous advances that we've witnessed in terms of LGBTQ plus rights. I remember what it felt like to see the White House lit up in rainbow colors to celebrate the Supreme Court's ruling that affirmed same-sex marriage. It was exactly 2 months to the day after my mom died, and my mom would have loved to see the White House lit up like that. Well, she didn't get to see that moment. I was sitting next to her when President Obama, we watched him deliver his second inaugural address, in which he not only mentioned the Stonewall riots, but became the first US president to mention gay people in an inaugural address explicitly. And there's a quotation from it on the slide that you can see. I share all of this to say that I don't take any of it for granted. When I married my partner, we eloped in Washington, D.C. During an NCTE convention because gay marriage was not legal in the state of Georgia where we lived. Like so many of us, I imagine in this, in the audience, virtual audience here today, I understand how fragile these rights can be, as we're seeing in so many different places and for so many different people. I have a lot of fear right now. I'm afraid of the path that we're on, and I wonder what will happen when doctors are allowed to refuse to care for LGBTQ plus people, or store owners can refuse to provide services to LGBTQ plus people because it goes against something like religious beliefs. I'm afraid of what will happen when safe access to things like bathrooms or facilities are denied. I'm afraid of mass killings in LGBTQ plus spaces. And I know LGBTQ plus people are certainly not the only population facing these types of things. Josh Coleman and I are beginning to work on a project together. And one of the things that we started doing to create a context for that work was creating a shared document where we just dropped in news articles we were finding related to LGBTQ plus youth and literature. I think we kind of stopped doing that after a while because it's become really difficult to keep up with it. There have been 137 different bills limiting what schools can teach on race, history, sexual orientation, and gender, according to an article in The Independent on February 5th, 2022 by Gustav Killander. From the Don't Say Gay bill that was just signed into law in Florida, to anti-trans legislation in states like Arizona and Texas, to the Mississippi Republican who called for the execution of trans people by firing squad, and the countless book challenges and burnings across the country. Today, we need allies, we need advocates, and we need accomplices. But first, I need to define those terms. Something else I noticed across the Baker Diversity Lecture Series presentations was the importance of establishing and identifying the context, so what's happening in the world today that informs what we're sharing. And then in many presentations, including those by Katie Dover-Taylor and Stacey Collins, time is devoted to defining terms and underscoring the importance of shared understanding of language. So for example, I'm using the initialism LGBTQ+, and I'm using it as shorthand for a broader initialism that would be something along the lines of LGBTQIA2SPP, which is sometimes used to stand for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, questioning, intersex, asexual, two-spirit, pansexual, and polyamorous. So that's one initialism that I'm using, LGBTQ+. And then over the past several months, I've been reading extensively about allyship to try and arrive at a working definition and maybe some insights for all of us today. So the primary term that I need to identify and define for us is allyship. I'm really trying to resist being too academic-y, but I'm going to start by defining what allyship is not. So allies, what came out of the reading that I did and what I've seen and learned from the Baker lectures, talking with colleagues and doing this work, is that allies typically don't think of allyship as a component of their identity. Mia McKenzie has an excellent article from 2013 on the blog Black Girl Dangerous that's titled "No More, quote, Allies," that addresses this. McKenzie writes, allyship is not supposed to be about you. It's not supposed to be about your feelings. It's not supposed to be a way of glorifying yourself at the expense of the folks you claim to be an ally to. It's not supposed to be a performance. It's supposed to be a way of living your life that doesn't reinforce the same oppressive behaviors that you're claiming to be against. Speaking from my own personal experience, I couldn't, through the course of this entire time putting this together, think of one moment in which someone identified themselves as an ally in that sort of way, and then what followed was productive or positive. Kimberly Hardin suggests that those who view ally as an identity tend to be prone to more virtue signaling. And Joel Leone, who I cited at the beginning of the talk, says that self-proclaimed allies are typically doing a kind of surface level allyship work, which may be admirable, but can often leave those on the sidelines wondering, is your care for the community or your ego? An example of this type of allyship could be a straight cisgender person who refers to themselves as an LGBTQ plus ally and then gets really angry and lashes out when asked questions, or if told that the thing that they're doing that they think is a good thing could actually be causing harm to the population that they say that they care about. So then, defining allyship, allyship is not an identity, it's a verb, a thing that you do. It's a moment-to-moment type of thing. And to demonstrate this point, I'll extend something that was shared. I think it's useful by John Randolph, who works under the name J. Smooth. His work as a cultural commentator may be familiar to you for a number of reasons. He has been cited in previous Baker lectures, such as the 2020 talk by Anna Coates on microaggression. Here, though, I want to touch on what Smooth says about how to tell someone that something they did is racist. Smooth argues that instead of falling into a trap of labeling somebody a racist, we can instead center our attention on what someone did or said. So he uses this example of pickpocketing. If he's got his wallet in his pocket and somebody takes his wallet, it doesn't matter to him if that person feels like they're a thief or if they feel like they're a pickpocket. If he focuses on the fact that you took my wallet out of my pocket, it becomes about that thing you did, the act of pickpocketing, rather than an identity as a pickpocket. So then if we think in terms of race or sexual identity, instead of saying or focusing on something like saying that thing you did is homophobic, we avoid things like people becoming defensive and saying, but I'm an ally. You know, I always advocate for LGBTQ plus people. If we focus on acts rather than identities, we can depersonalize in ways that focus and can help foster more productive discussions and better advance the work of allyship. So let's jump back then to what allyship is not. Allyship is not centering ourselves rather than using positions of power or privilege to raise the voices of others. So I'm going to share an example here that I wasn't sure I was going to share. When I was a young professor in Florida, I received an email from a really powerful and well-known person in the field. So I was fresh out of grad school and my first job, starting to do work around gender and queerness. And this really famous person wrote me and said that they wanted to know more about my work. They asked about my code book, my process of reading and analyzing text and illustration. So I was thrilled. I thought this was my moment that, you know, here's this really famous person. Maybe they're looking for somebody to join their research team. So I sent back a lengthy response. I gave a copy of my code book, my process of reading and analyzing, put it all out there as much as I could. And then I heard nothing back, like ever again, never heard another word. A year or so later, a couple of years later, that individual and their research team had incorporated what I shared with them into their work and then presented it as if it were new and something that they came up with on their own. So there was an article published in one of the leading journals for library services for youth. There are things included in materials created and disseminated online in professional development. And nowhere in there does it cite my work or anyone else whose work I think it draws on as well. I haven't shared that story publicly ever because I've been fearful that, you know, I wouldn't be believed for the story. So fast forward to a couple of years ago, I'm now an old professor in Georgia, and a junior colleague comes to me very excited and says, I just got an email from that same person, and they want to know about my work on this topic. And so I spoke candidly with that individual who is much more altruistic than I am, because they said, well, that's fine if that happens, as long as it benefits the field. I felt really, you know, egotistical when they shared that. So they made the decision to go ahead and provide the information the person was asking, who then did the exact same thing in this new context. Now, it's possible that I just happened to have had the fortune or misfortune to see this happen the only 2 times it occurred, but I think it's more likely that this is the way in which the person operates, and it's not the only 2 times that it happened. Instead, of centering themselves. I think those are examples in which the person could have brought others into the conversation and lifted them up as young scholars. So then, allies focus on centering other people. We can add that to our definition. The last thing I'll say here in terms of what's not allyship would fall into this idea of rejecting what we're told because it doesn't align with what we believe about ourselves or what we want to believe about ourselves in the world. I think a prominent way in which we see this in children's literature studies it involves white privilege or straight cis privilege, and it can manifest itself in resistance to believing what we're told about academic context. So I'm imagining lots of us may engage with colleagues who will ask things like, is this space really racist? Is this space really homophobic? Is it any worse here than it is other places? Does anyone do it better? These types of questions that's often coupled with people saying things like, I keep asking and no one's been able to show me a single example of racism or sexism or ableism. And I think there's a lot of power embedded in that position, and unpacking all of it's going to be beyond the scope of the talk that I can do right now. But the privilege of being able to demand evidence, and on top of that, the instances that I'm thinking of here are places and times in which that data has been provided publicly, in person, in speeches, in writing, in video recordings, and in survey and interview data collected by third parties. Like, there's a lot of data. We hear again and again and again about things being problematic, but those in positions of privilege have the power to ignore or reject or determine whether or not something's evidence enough of racism or homophobia. So then, as Mia McKenzie writes in Black Girl Dangerous, the book that grew out of the blog, allies are people who shut up and listen. There's privilege in not knowing or not needing to know or refusing to know, and those in power get to reject or refuse to know. Listening and believing is a key component of allyship. And then, as Clay Rivers succinctly writes, allies listen and they trust the stories they hear. So if I were to share with you that even a couple of years ago, I was walking my dog down the street and some random person threw packages of sweet and sour sauce at me and called me a faggot, like, I'd want you to believe me when I told you that. If I shared a story that at my very first university job, I had a department chair who asked me to put away my queer theory books or put them on a less visible shelf because they didn't fit with the image of the university, I'd want you to believe that as well. These types of things happen all the time on a daily basis, not to me, but to people in general. Luckily, not me every day. So the last thing I'll touch on, in the interest of time, I'm going to go through it super quickly because you'll have the slides. You can go back and pause. Some folks who study allyship, like Dr. Kimberly Hardin in the Allyship Challenge, she presents a framework of ally hyphen advocate hyphen accomplice that are kind of levels people can move through, going from a more performative ally to being what would be referred to as an advocate or an accomplice. So different folks have different ways of defining it and thinking about it. I think for our purposes, let me go through it a little slowly. Pulled from a number of the things that I've read, these tend to be kind of some general things that come through in terms of what are the acts that allies do. So they do things like study, they listen and follow the lead of others, acknowledge their own racism and privilege, make lots of friends, they do political things, write or speak as appropriate in personal settings, and then they put their money where their mouth is and put themselves out there. In general, what came up is the idea that advocates tend to work on a more systemic level, and then accomplices are folks who are willing to set the world on fire, like burn it down and start again, really putting through an action with their money and putting their jobs and their lives on the line in support of equity. So typically in the professional literature about LGBTQ plus allies, there's a focus on straight people being those allies. But I think it's essential that we remember how LGBTQ plus is a big umbrella term. So even those of us who identify as a member, should be and can be allies and accomplices to others. So I am a cis gay man. I am not transgender. I'm not lesbian. I'm not bisexual. I'm not pansexual. So I might be an expert on my own identity, but I am not an expert on all the identities included in the umbrella. And just by being a cis gay man, it doesn't automatically make me any sort of ally to anyone else who falls underneath that initialism. So then thinking about what this might mean for us as educators, there's a great deal of work out there specifically for teachers. And oftentimes this is classroom teachers. More broadly, it's for educators, which of course I think includes librarians. And some of the general things that allies are seen to do, or what people who are looking for allies say, these are the types of things we want to see happen, are going to be familiar. Things like looking inward and doing our own work, providing representation. And one of the things that comes up in almost every one of the Baker lectures that I saw is the importance of representation, but then two, how representation is not enough. So I'll talk more about representation in a minute. Understanding, assessing, leveraging policies and position statements. Katie Dover-Taylor again talked about strategic plans and looking at those documents, as well as missions and core values, which I think is essential to the work. Modeling and setting expectations. I have some community norms up on there from an article I did with two of my other writing and thought partners, Susie Kinesic and Roberta Price Gardner, but there are lots. Anna Coates shared ground rules at the start of her presentation as well. So I wanted to note those, that she actually started hers by saying these are the rules as we engage in this talk together. So then interrupting, speaking back to intolerance, and not being afraid to make mistakes. So a few practices I love when I see people do in terms of things that make me feel like I'm surrounded by allies, or I'm in a more safe place, is when I see people who have learned some terms and then can mirror terms back in the ways in which they talk. I don't expect anybody to be an expert on queer history, but it's so nice when people know some and it comes up and there's something to talk about. I like in contexts that are not performative, but when straight people come out and share their pronouns, it's a way of showing awareness. And then thinking about language, use a spouse and partner versus wife or husband. My partner and I are in the process of selling our house, and we were on the phone yesterday with somebody talking about something related to it. And I used spouse, and then the person went back and like talked with me about my wife, and we like rolled our eyes. So that kind of thing happens all over the place too. Those assumptions about heterosexuality kind of come through in unexpected ways. Okay, so as I turn the page to the final portion of this talk, I'll focus specifically on things that I think are important for allies and accomplices in youth library services to consider regarding LGBTQ plus youth. As Downey wrote in 2005, libraries and librarians are in the powerful and important position of being able to help reduce risks faced by LGBTQ youth by providing access to materials and information. LGBT youth also identify libraries as safe havens and state that libraries and librarians are places that they turn in different pieces of research, like the big school climate survey that I'll talk about in a moment as well. In addition to this, we're seeing increased identification in the number of individuals who self-identify as LGBTQ+, and that this number is expected to grow. So I think it's becoming even more important, and it'll be continue to be a prominent part of conversation. Okay. So I'm going to draw on what lots of different folks do in the Baker lectures and rely on some statistics. So oftentimes these statistics will come from like the US Census, population statistics, and many people in library services will cite the ALA Office of Research and Statistics. So for me, in Georgia, this is the state in which I live, the US Census Bureau estimates that we're 10th in the nation for the number of households with same-sex couples. 23% of those households are raising children. And yet findings from GLSEN's 2019 National School Climate Survey demonstrate that Georgia schools are not safe for most lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer secondary school students. In addition, many LGBTQ students in Georgia didn't have access to important resources like gender and sexuality alliances, gay straight alliances, or similar clubs, and were not protected by supportive and inclusive school policies. So GLSEN actually has state-by-state reports available that provides recommendations for schools and educators in each state. So if you're looking for statistics on things related to your specific state, they are a great resource for that. So population estimates suggest that 12.8% of the city of Atlanta adults are LGBTQ identified. I live in Atlanta. So 12.8% is about double the national average. So I live in a super gay area. As I identified recommendations and strategies for libraries, I became really curious about how this would look in my super gay community. So one of the things that I did after I went through I'll jump back to that in a second. And I gathered materials, looking at different tools and instruments that I could use to assess library spaces. I analyzed the website of one of our county library systems and its contents. I read and analyzed the library policies. I searched and analyzed the catalog, and then I visited the branches. Let me jump back here. Metro Atlanta is a big area with multiple counties represented. So one of our county library systems has 34 branches, another has 21, another has 15. So as I prepared for this session, I went to every single one of the branches in one of those counties and assess what their environments were like and what their holdings are like. So as I go through and share these recommendations, I'm going to tie it back to one of these counties that will be anonymous, because I figure if I'm in a super gay area, we should probably be doing as well, if not better, than what we might see elsewhere. So I was really curious to see what it looked like in my community in terms of our libraries here. Some caveats to that are things like, I mean, it's a big assumption that just because we have a big gay population that we might have good representation. It's also, there are assumptions embedded there about things like what might be on the shelves. So if I didn't see it on the shelves, it doesn't mean necessarily that those books aren't there. They could be checked out. I know too that collection issues are often well beyond the scope and control of individual librarians or even branches with the librarians I spoke with. Okay, so as we think about how we can be allies and accomplices for LGBTQ plus people, there's that idea of representation, about seeing ourselves represented in books. And so I wanted to look at the holdings. And I think one thing we can all be doing is look at the holdings that we have. Are there LGBTQ plus books available in our libraries? And then who's represented in those books? So we can use one of the many tools available for assessing the contents of a library. Oftentimes these will be related to classroom libraries, but they can be used in any library context. So Howlett and Young have a really great tool for assessing the content of a library. Do the holdings have LGBTQ plus related media and periodicals? And so the little table that you can see at the top of this slide is one that I put together based off of Wikipedia, just like what LGBTQ plus periodicals are currently in print. And those are just the numbers there. Lots of them in terms of regional parts of the country, different ways of life, different cities will have specific ones. So there are a number of resources you can look to if you're looking for LGBTQ plus periodicals. I wonder too, can one search for LGBTQ plus books in library catalogs? And in my case, I could. I was able to look for keywords, including homosexual, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer. And so I searched the catalogs for those terms, both with YA books and then juvenile as well. And those were the numbers there. And I'm going to just give a general number just to keep it as anonymous as I can for where I went and looked. If we divided it across branches and assume, no repetition and things like that, meaning a book that shows up for homosexual doesn't also show up for gay or bisexual. If we assume these are all different books, what it amounted to in my case was fewer than 10 YA books and fewer than 10 juvenile books per branch. So on average, let's say that there would be 20 books available. There's of course part of me that feels discouraged by that because there are so many great books that are available, and we need so much more. I've done this sort of thing in the past with other library systems, and those numbers actually aren't bad compared to what I've seen elsewhere. But of course, we want more books than that included, both fiction, nonfiction. One way we can help build these collections is by encouraging community involvement in collection development when patrons are asking for these things. Of course, that can help as well. I'm going to touch on a lot of these in future slides in the last couple minutes that I've got together or with us together. So I won't read through all of them here, but essentially in looking at LGBTQ plus inclusive environments, I went in asking questions like, in what ways are the library spaces visibly safe for LGBTQ plus youth? What books are included in displays? Are there visible markers that librarians are wearing that might indicate that they are safe spaces with pronouns or a safe space logo? Evidence of inclusive language, looking at different pamphlets and things like that. So from the time I walked in the door, I looked at pamphlets, went in and looked at the environment, looked around at different books, things like that. So a big one for me was like looking for visible things on the wall. These are all available from ALA. And so the one on the very left is different book awards for children's and young adult literature, a couple of which happen to be for LGBTQ plus books. So that's just a sign about award-winning books that has that type of content there. There's some more overtly open things, such as on the very right, the June is GLBT Book Month. And then there are other ways that we could include representation, which is just to have some of those read posters up with people who happen to be queer identified as well. I was disappointed as I went through the Atlanta libraries that I did not see any of that anywhere at any of the branches that I went to. Other things I looked for in inclusive environments. Was there evidence that there's a GSA or a club that addresses LGBTQ plus issues or provides supports? And then again, like evidence of supportive staff, things like that I did not see. The library rules were posted where everybody could see them. They were also available online. They explicitly addressed respect for all visitors. They addressed anti-bullying, anti-harassment, which was great. I was hoping for language specifically related to gender and sexual identity and didn't see that there. But overall, with the other policies, I felt like they were touching on those, although not explicitly. And then looking at ways in which books are included. So looking for books included in general reading lists and book lists. And I saw lots of that. It seemed like that was a way in which librarians were including books. So it would be on a certain topic or a specific genre of lots of different books. And then it would include some queer texts in there. And then I looked for book lists and reading lists specifically related to LGBTQ plus books, as that's something that would function in a different way. And there were two that I located, both created by the same librarian, one related to fiction and one related specifically to YA books. So I did see lots of things in terms of books included on reading lists, and then also specific reading lists. I didn't see any books included in displays or books displayed on the shelves. So that was one thing that felt important that I didn't see there. And then one other thing that I think is can be kind of controversial, or it's more loaded, I think, is considering whether or not to label book spines. One of the good things about having a label on the book spine is, of course, we can quickly identify the text. But all of you know the problems that could potentially come with that in terms of easy to identify and locate and challenge and things like that. So I talked with my brother and sister who are pretty savvy. I would say they're both allies and accomplices in terms of LGBTQ plus people. So they know quite a bit and they do quite a bit. So I asked them what they would think if they saw a book with Stonewall written on it. And they didn't know what that was. So if you have award winners, for example, you could put the name of the award on there. And so there might be some ways to move around that. Other things that I saw in terms of what ALA can recommend is things like labeling spines with a rainbow sticker or something like that. And then I looked, of course, for the big like what sign is there of LGBTQ or all gender restrooms. And because of time, I won't go into these different signs and things. Ideally, something along the lines of what's on the right that just says all gender restrooms seems a good way to go. That one was created by Sam Killerman, who's the author of A Guide to Gender, and you can download that for free off of his website and print it and use it anywhere. So that will be included in some resources that I wanted to provide you with. As I wrap up and move to conversation, Sierra, if you don't mind dropping a link into the chat, I wanted to leave you with things that are tangible as opposed to just listening to me share notes and thoughts for about 45 minutes. And so I've created a Google Doc. It's got my name on it now, but I'm going to take that off as soon as we're done here because it will be beyond the purpose of this presentation, in which I've tried to put together glossaries and guides for terminology, toolkits and videos for educators, as well as some specifically for librarians. There are links to webinars, book lists, information on restrooms, info on inclusive library cards, lists of US LGBT periodicals, a list of important dates, different book awards, bibliographies, organizations for youth and families, and some interactive maps of US LGBT bookstores, libraries, and archives. I'm going to be removing my name at the end of this talk because I would love it if you find it useful. Feel free to share it. It's a Google Doc, so feel free to add things. The links I'm trying to keep on top of in there, but even in the time I put it together and then tested it today, a couple of them had changed. So feel free to update it, use it however you want to, and make it your own. But I hope it's a helpful starting point as you think about some big ways and some smaller ways in which we can incorporate LGBTQ plus allyship into youth library services. And now I will stop talking and then hopefully open it up to conversation with all of you. Thank you so much.
So thank you so much. This was amazing. And I am just stunned with the resource list and grateful for you taking the time to put that together and sharing with us. So folks, we have time for questions for Dr. Thomas Crisp. So if you have some, please do put them in the chat box. Or if you would like to raise your hand, we have a small enough group today that you can certainly come off mic and have, ask your question verbally. So do we have any questions?
I just wanted to say that I really appreciate the comments about peers and sharing that with us today, because that's something that I have seen a lot of, and in this community, LGBTQ plus. So I really appreciate that. It's more of a comment than anything else. So I really don't have a question, but I appreciate that.
Thanks. There's a personal part of it for me too. Like if part of it's inevitable. I'm such a nervous personality that it would be ridiculous for me to try and deny it and hide it. So I think that allows me to just, let the fear be out there.
So you have a question in the chat. What was the instrument you mentioned to assess a collection?
I will make sure I include it in the resources. It's not there now. It's Howlett and Young, HOWLETT. And then the other author is Young, YOUNG. And it's related to multicultural classroom libraries in quotation marks. Let me see if I can pull it up super fast. Somebody else is going to be faster than I am. Got it. Unless someone else already does. Building a classroom library based on multicultural principles, a checklist for future K-6 teachers. And it's actually, the full text is available through Eric. So I'm going to drop that into the chat now. Oh, did Sarah get it? Looks like she may have beaten me to it. And that is wonderful. Thank you.
Yes, and we will get that added to the Google Doc as well. Another question for you. What was the name of the scholar you mentioned earlier? Black Girl Magic, something along those lines?
Oh, Black Girl Dangerous?
Yes.
Mia McKenzie.
Okay, perfect.
And that was a blog and then a book that came out of it as well. And it looks like some of the blog content might not be there anymore. Lots of it is there. But there's often a link to the book, which is fantastic as well.
All right, while we're waiting for other questions to come in, I wanted to ask you, and you don't have to answer, you can, share as much or as little. You've had some very significant service work to the profession during which you had to be an ally. So I don't want to make you uncomfortable, but just why is it important, even, in that setting professionally with our colleagues, to be allies and accomplices?
That's a tough question, because, all right, all right, so I'll share an example of something that happened that felt important to me. I mean, it makes sense in the profession that lots of us are in, like it makes sense to care deeply about the world being a safe and equitable place for everyone. For me, as a gay man, I am always so relieved when I don't have to be the one to speak up when I see and hear and experience acts of microaggressions or oppression that impact me directly. So I'm remembering a time when someone came in to do a job talk, and they had us working with different groups of books, of nonfiction books, and they were different minoritized populations. We were working with them, and there were no gay people there. And one of my colleagues said, I noticed that in these, how did you identify which sets of books to bring in and which ones didn't? And I was kind of expecting them to say something like, well, these are the books that I had, or very practically, these are the books I could get. And that colleague specifically said, I noticed there's no LGBTQ plus people here. Can you talk a little bit about why that is? And the response that was given was, well, I only picked books that are nonfiction, so they focus on historically significant people. And so that's why there's not any gay people represented. And I remember that feeling that comes with that of just like outrage and anger mixed with like, dear God, I got to talk about this again. And then I'm going to risk looking like, oh, there's the gay guy with his issue that he's talking, all those things that can come up. And so when I had a colleague who stepped in and spoke and confronted it, and I didn't have to be the one to do it, that sense of not being in the spotlight, that feeling of safety, that feeling of being cared for and supported, meant a tremendous amount. And that's the kind of thing I think lots of us hope to do in our professional and personal work.
Yeah, thank you so much. While you were speaking, it reminded me of just last week when Ketanji Brown Jackson was being confirmed, or going through the motions of being confirmed for the Supreme Court. And, every Black woman I know was simultaneously enraged and numb by the treatment she received. And to have, folks speak up for her, Cory Booker in particular, just like you said, it was just such a relief, to not only have that validation, but to have someone see you and see that experience. And like you were saying, in such a way that you don't have to defend it or define it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Are there other questions? We still have a couple of minutes. There's so much good stuff here.
I don't really have a specific question, but I did want to thank Dr. Crisp for this really great conversation. I was just having a chat online the other day with a couple of authors and librarians about this whole issue around, categorizing books and how do we figure out what to do with books that are LGBTQ plus in libraries, and how do we get people to find them, but then also not make them too obvious. And it's just such an important conversation that we're having, and there's no real easy answers, but I just wanted to thank you for engaging with that and bringing it up in this conversation.
That's Rob Bittner, the guy I mentioned earlier. Good to see you. Where did you end up with it, Rob? Can I ask?
We didn't really come up with a solution. It's still going on. It's just basically people are talking about all the different ways that they try to make them easily accessible to youth and adults who need them, and also not making them stand out so specifically that somebody who wants to target those books can just walk in and start like, grabbing them off the shelves and trying to, get rid of them or something. And it's just it's a very much a tension of like, how do you make them accessible and available, and how do you also keep them from being targeted and being the target of, people who want to see them gone.
I talked with one librarian, not in this context of when I went and looking for books, but in another one where she talked about like keeping the books behind the desk, but then as the people have to know A, that they're available, B, to ask for them, where to ask for them. There was another library that I went to, again, in another context, where they were kept in like a glass case, which then, they're locked in a glass case, so you can't get to them either, but they're protected. I mean, there's just some really strange, the politics and dynamics of all of that are so complicated. So finding something that I think works in a specific context has got to be the way to go, as opposed to like a general rule.
Yeah, and I mean, if you have them like locked in that cabinet, well, then what does that say to like the young people who want to look at those books? It's like, oh, sorry, the books about people like you have to be locked away.
Yeah.
It's like, what does that say to you as a young person, right? Like that's a horrible thing to have there right in your face. So
Absolutely.
But anyway, I know it's no easy solution, but I just did want to thank you for bringing that up and grappling with it a little bit in your talk.
Thanks for being here and for all the work that you do.
Thank you so much. And that is a great way for us to segue to our closing. Please join me, if you haven't already, in thanking Dr. Crisp for joining us and giving us such wonderful information and resources, and giving us a way to continue this evergreen, ever important conversation. Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure. And thank you again for accepting my invitation to participate.
Thank you for the invite. I'm so beyond grateful. You have no idea. So thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening, a good week. And our final Baker lecture of the season is coming up. We'll be joined by members of the Chinese American Library Association, and we're finishing up our deep dive into the National Association of Librarians of Color. So we hope you can join us. Thanks so much for spending some time with us today. Good night.
Good night.